Hello, everyone. My name is Ian, and welcome to the Walking with Legends podcast. I want to be the first to thank you for your support of the podcast. It's a joy to be able to examine the lives and careers of exceptional athletes and personnel on both the professional and local levels, and to be able to share it with you is an amazing experience. I encourage you to feel free to chime in on a weekly basis if you have any requests for future episodes, or know of any exceptional local athletes, coaches, or personnel that you would love to hear the stories of on the podcast. If you want to communicate with us, feel free to email us at walkwithlegends@gmail.com, and if you provide us with any content that ends up being used, you'll receive a personal shout-out on the podcast intro. Thank you for your support, and enjoy the podcast. If you ask any athlete what their motivations are for playing, you may get a variety of answers, like making as much money as possible, winning championships, having a social platform, or experiencing the camaraderie and joy of playing with teammates. But one thing that's pretty standard among athletes is the desire for their team to become legendary, to be known throughout history for accomplishing something that's special, or maybe even impossible to replicate. Today's team found themselves on the wrong end of that spectrum when they did in fact do something that had never been done before in history, but for all the wrong reasons. Today, we examine a year in review of the 2008 Detroit Lions football team. Welcome to Walking with Legends, the podcast dedicated to telling the stories behind the most iconic athletes and teams in sports history and what made them become a legend. When you ask a fan of an NFL team what their team represents, or something that their team is known for, you'll likely get a quick answer of a player, coach, or team that did something extraordinary during their tenure on the team. If you're a Dallas Cowboys fan, you draw memories of their championship runs from the 90s. Or if you love the Green Bay Packers, you think of legends like Vince Lombardi or Brett Favre. The New England Patriots have the success of Tom Brady and Bill Belichick to fall on, and so on and so on. But what if opposing fan bases identify your team by an infamous season of futility instead of achievement? It's been a long-running joke for fans living in and around the Detroit area that the team did in fact achieve the, quote, perfect season in 2008, but instead of winning every game, they lost every game, becoming the first team ever in NFL history to go 0-16 in a season. And although the Cleveland Browns replicated that feat in 2017, it's a long-standing belief among sports writers and fans that even that team would have been steadily defeated by the infamous 2008 team. But the question is, how did they get to that point? What went wrong? The story began several years earlier when, in 2001, the Detroit Lions hired Matt Millen as president of the team, giving him the reins to the franchise. Long story short, there were several questionable decisions that Millen made during his tenure that really set the team back compared to their peers in the league. One of the biggest hits came from draft decisions that he made throughout the years, as there were several instances where the team took gambles on players that ultimately became busts in the league. In 2002, the Lions drafted Joey Harrington with the 3rd overall pick, who would go on to have minimal success for the team in the next few years. Though it wasn't completely his fault, it was still a bust of a pick. From 2003 to 2005, the Lions used each one of their first-round draft picks, all in the top 10, to select wide receivers, which is often seen as a huge gamble to do in the draft, selecting Charles Rogers, Mike Williams, and Roy Williams. Only Roy Williams would experience success in the league, and the other two were considered big busts. At the end of his run, Millen amassed the worst win-loss ratio of any head of a team with a 31-84 record, and was subsequently fired after the infamous losing season. Believe it or not, hopes were very high for the 2008 Detroit Lions team going into the season. The previous year, the team went 7-9, but ran an effective passing offense, staying competitive even in losses. Senior management on the team had high hopes that by adding some pieces in the draft, the team would be able to reach the next level and have playoff implications. That year, the Lions selected Gosder Cherilus with their first-round draft pick, with the hopes that he would be able to take over for an inconsistent longtime Lion, Jeff Backus, on the offensive line to help solidify it. The team was also able to draft several other players that would go on to find success both on the Lions and in the NFL in general, with players like Kevin Smith, a running back out of the University of Central Florida, Cliff Averill, a defensive end out of Purdue, and Jerome Felton, a fullback from Furman. Everything seemed to be pointing towards a productive year on paper, but as sports has proven time and time again, it's one thing to be solid on paper, and it's another to be productive in actuality. The preseason began on a high note, as the Lions were able to show some signs of progress by going undefeated, and we really do mean wins this time, in their run during the preseason, finishing 4-0. This fact further added fuel to the fire of jokes from fans after the season, stating that they did in fact have a perfect season, it just happened in the preseason instead of the actual season. Despite the stigma surrounding the team, the Lions did possess many talented players on their roster, who were coming off of productive careers, or would go on to have productive careers. The Lions boasted a talented pool of quarterbacks, with longtime veterans Dante Culpepper, who was picked up halfway through the season, and John Kitna leading the way. Culpepper was only a few years removed from multiple statistically successful seasons with the Minnesota Vikings, and Kitna had shown his ability to put up statistics in previous season for the Lions as well. The team also boasted 3 young players who had been drafted in the previous 5 seasons, which gave the team options going forward. At wide receiver, the Lions boasted some great options such as Roy Williams and Calvin Johnson, who, despite all the adversity experienced during the year, happened to have a very productive season, and would become a staple for the Lions team going forward. Despite this collection of talent, the offensive unit dealt with a lot of adversity throughout the season. Both Culpepper and Kitna would go down with injuries throughout the season, thrusting previously unknown Dan Orlovsky into the starting role, where he experienced little success. The unit would go on to average about 17 points per game, which was good for 6th worst in the league. This was partly due to a transaction that occurred during the season when wide receiver Roy Williams, a longtime Detroit Lions player, was traded to the Dallas Cowboys mid-season. While this may be seen as a turning point for the career of Calvin Johnson, as he was elevated to the main receiver role, which he would retain for the rest of his career, it also gave opposing defenses an easier game plan for the rest of the season. This is because the remainder of the Lions receiving corps wasn't anywhere near as talented as Johnson or Williams was. So when Williams departed, defenses were then able to double cover and pressure Johnson in order to take his productivity out of the game. While this may be beneficial if teams possess other playmakers, such as a running game, the Lions weren't able to produce much else, as poor offensive line play held back the productivity of a talented running back in Kevin Smith. The offensive line surrendered a horrendous 52 sacks to opposing defenses during the year, and only gave the Lions rushers 3.8 yards a carry. Now, before we jump to conclusions and blame the offense for all the team's woes, it was very evident that the defense had their fair share of struggles as well. As is the case in all of sports, football is a team game, and if one or more units experience difficulty, the team as a whole suffers as a result. While the team did boast a fair assortment of players on offense, the same could not be said for the team on defense, and the team suffered as a result. Statistically, the defense was the worst in the league that year, surrendering an average of 32.3 points per game, almost double the amount of points that the team was producing on offense, and surrendered almost 405 yards a game. The unit was only able to get 4 interceptions the whole year, which was worst in the league, and opponents ran all over the defense, racking up nearly 172 yards a game and 5.1 yards per attempt. Opponents would score on 45% of their drives compared to only 26% of the drives for Detroit's offense. All of this is to say the defense was not good. Now, these are a lot of statistics to throw at you, but it really boils down to the point that the team dramatically underperformed from expectations. Through a combination of injuries, mismanagement, and honestly luck, the team was able to achieve the seemingly impossible and lost every game that season. If you think about it, this was something that no team in NFL history had ever done, and for good reason. In the history of the NFL, only 10 teams have had seasons where they have only won one game. The NFL, by definition, is a league full of professional players. Although teams can have cycles where they underperform, more often than not, they eventually progress back to being competitive. Very rarely has a team experienced enough adversity through management, injuries, and drafting failures to put together a team that can lose every game, and lest we forget, the Lions went 7-9 in the previous year and came into the season with a lot of confidence. In the end, what it really boils down to is that sometimes teams are just unlucky. In their 5th game of the season against the Minnesota Vikings, Dan Orlovsky, the Lions quarterback, infamously ran out of the back of the end zone, causing the team to give up a safety, and the team would eventually lose the game. In a game against the Chicago Bears, the team led 23-13 at halftime, but gave up a late touchdown in the game to lose by 4 points. The opportunities were definitely there for the Lions to win at least one game, but didn't ultimately happen. Another reason that some sports writers believe may have contributed to the Lions losing, especially late in the season, was simply that opposing teams didn't want to lose to the Lions. While it may sound silly, it's true that no team wants to be known for losing to a team that they should have no problem defeating. During the last game of the season against the Green Bay Packers, the Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers admitted after the game that the team gave their absolute best effort despite not having any playoff implications for the team, as they just didn't want to have the distinction of losing to the Lions. If you think about it, professional teams and athletes have a lot of pride in what they do, and while the Lions were playing for a win, any win, other teams were instinctively playing, as the old saying goes, to not lose. After the season was completed, the media, understandably, wanted to be able to get into the minds of the players and coaches and see how it felt to be on the wrong side of history. To his credit, head coach Rod Marinelli did his best to find a positive spin on the experience when he said, quote, "The record speaks for itself, and we know what that is. My feelings about it will be kept to myself. This team tried hard all year long. They gave it their best, and I felt that I gave it my best. But sometimes your best isn't good enough, and it wasn't good enough this year." End quote. Some players, including longtime center Dominic Raiola, were understandably upset about the new blemish on their careers, and when asked about his future with the team, he said, quote, "I believe I'm going to be here where we get to turn this thing around. That's what I believe. I'm sure everybody has to think about what they're going to do, and are they even going to be here? I'm sure some people probably said, you know what, screw it. I'm not going to be here anyways. It's not a big deal, but I've got to live with this. I've been here 8 years and now it's on my resume. This is what I worked hard for since March. It's such bull." End quote. Another longtime Lions player and team captain, kicker Jason Hanson, provided some of the most insight into the minds of the players and fans when he gave his comments saying, quote, "I've thought about this. Where we're at now is because of 6 months ago, decisions that were made by players in off-season work. This didn't come out of nowhere. As players, we have to rethink about what we did. But whatever. This is just terrible." When he was asked if Detroit's 0-16 record might have been 8 years in the making, which was an implication that the roster put together by former President Matt Millen, Hanson had this to say, "It didn't come out of nowhere. It's a bad deal. I feel mostly bad for Lions fans, really. Everybody here. This is us, and we own this. But it's worse for Lions fans. We did it, but for them, they've been supporting us, and we couldn't get it done. I think most guys know, staring in the mirror, that it was us. Everybody's embarrassed. When I say we feel bad, it's worse than that. Hopefully everybody who was around can do something about it." End quote. Sports writers and fans alike will often try and compare players and teams from different years and generations to determine who was the best. And the infamous season from the Detroit Lions is no different. Since the 2007 Cleveland Browns team matched the Lions by becoming the only teams to go 0-16 in a season, people have often tried to compare the two teams, almost humorously, in order to determine which team was better, or, in actuality, what team was worse. While we could join in on the fun, diving into the statistics and trying to determine an outcome, what many failed to realize is that the circumstances behind both teams' stories were very different. The 2017 Cleveland Browns were coming off of a 1-15 season, and the state of the franchise had been in disarray for many years prior. The team had clearly taken a stance that they wanted to prioritize draft capital and putting their faith in younger players, and whenever teams try to pursue this route, it's understandably going to take time to develop talent and become competitive. As a result, the Browns essentially were willing to sacrifice, so to speak, a few seasons record-wise in order to become more competitive in the long term. And they can see these results now as their team has shown that they're capable of competing and look to have a good season in the 2019 season. However, as we mentioned earlier, although the Lions had struggled to be competitive since the departure of Barry Sanders, the team had come into the season with high expectations, expecting to be competitive. In other words, they were trying to win. That's not to say that the Browns were trying to lose purposely when they lost, but rather they, along with the rest of the sports world, understood that they did not possess the pieces needed to be successful, and subsequently punted, so to speak, on their season to continue to rebuild instead. While it's likely to be a constant debate among fans, it ultimately doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, as both franchises have the distinct honor of being the only teams to have the ultimate season of futility. As a fan of the Detroit Lions myself, I understand that sometimes the best way to deal with the situation is just to laugh it off. Although the season was ultimately a failure, a lot of good things happened for the Lions going forward as a result of this tumultuous season. For starters, as a result of having the worst record in the league, the Lions were given the number 1 pick in the draft, which they used to draft Matthew Stafford, who would soon become a staple quarterback of consistency for the team going forward. Although it took a few years for him to get going, the team ultimately found some success. The team also made some much-needed strategic decisions, including firing some key personnel like Matt Millen as the president of the team, Rod Marinelli as the head coach, several coordinators, and even moving on from many players. Although it's very difficult to improve in every facet of the team in a single season, or even in a stretch of seasons, the Lions did see significant improvement on defense in the next few seasons, which ultimately helped them make the playoffs for the first time since 1999, when they lost to the New Orleans Saints in 2011. It may not seem like much for the casual fan, but to turn a franchise around at all from such a dismal showing like the 2008 Lions did, or the 2017 Browns did, is an incredible achievement, and it's a great testament to teams like the New England Patriots as to just how hard teams have to work to stay competitive and experience success on a yearly basis. Regardless of if you're a fan of the Detroit Lions or not, the story behind their 2008 winless season is a fascinating culmination of a multitude of events that had to come together to produce something that had never been seen before in NFL history. It was a wake-up call for the franchise to make some dramatic changes to their personnel and culture to turn the team around. Although the sports world experiences a great deal of parity, where teams experience an almost cyclical form of success and failure, it proved that it was, in fact, possible for a team to experience a combination of injuries, incompetence, and a lack of luck to produce an unsatisfactory result, like losing every game of the season. and this caused the team to become a legend in history, although for the wrong reasons. Thank you for listening to the Walking with Legends podcast. We thank you for your support and encourage you to help share the podcast with your friends if you enjoy the content. We look forward to continuing to bring you quality sports stories and encourage you to chime in with any feedback if you know of any local or professional players, coaches, or personnel that you would love to see discussed on our platform. Until next time, have a legendary week.